Thank you all for coming today. My name is Maya Prabhu. I'm a faculty member in the School of Medicine in the Division of Law and Psychiatry, and I am so pleased to welcome you all here today on behalf of my many co-organizers, including Dane Ratliff, who's up here with me, who's a colleague of mine from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and who's also a former director of the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, and also Miraj Desai, who will be taking selfies with the crowd later. And who is also a member of the Department of Psychiatry and the School of Public Health. As I said earlier, I'm so heartened by the number of people who are interested and curious about the nexus between migration and climate. And what better time, dare I say, for such an event? In the past few years, since the signing of the Paris Accord, we have seen 1,000-year rainstorms occurring by the dozens. We've seen a massive coral bleaching incident that has affected 70% of the world's coral reefs. We've seen disastrous fires on every continent. And of course, just this week, we've had the publication of the most recent IPCC report, which should instill a greater sense of urgency and alarm in us than ever before, but I fear has not yet penetrated the consciousness of those who would be most important to read it. Before I walk you through the day and tell you a little bit about what you're going to hear today and who you're going to hear from, please let me thank a number of persons who made this event possible. First and foremost, please let me thank the MacMillan Center for its incredibly generous support in a variety of ways, as well as the Edward and Dorothy Clark Kemp Fund, the Yale Program in Refugees, Forced Displacement and Humanitarian Responses, the Asian American Cultural Center, the Yale Law and Psychiatry Division, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, which was very interested in this issue of how to respond and thinking about planetary health and how to have systems respond, and the Vice President's Office, which provided support from the Woodward Lectureship. And as I hope many of you will be able to attend tomorrow, we also had the benefit of tremendous intellectual contributions from a number of climate scientists based in Asheville, North Carolina, at a technical pre-conference that we had, and we'll talk to you more about it. But I would like to also give a special nod and thanks to Case Consultants, to the North Carolina Institute for Climate Studies, North Carolina State University, and many people from the NOAA staff, and some of them are here today, and they'll be very happy to talk to you about data and science, amongst other things. So today we have assembled a very broad cross-section of experts from multiple disciplines and multiple social, economic, and cultural backgrounds. And we thought, such a broad coalition to tackle issues, or this issue, which is truly interdisciplinary. Let me tell you a little bit about the questions for the day. In our very first panel, we have several people. We have Maisha Alam, Erica Bauer, Alyssa Parpia, who are going to ask some fundamental questions. What do we mean by climate migration? What are the causes of human mobility? How does climate change and climate factors or weather events influence the push and pull of persons? And who is most disproportionately affected by the factors that cause people to move? We'll be thinking about human security. We'll be thinking about political instability as well. In our second session after lunch, Michael Crook, Kanta Kamari-Ragode from the World Bank, Jesse Roubeau will allow us to stay, I'm going to say, evidence-driven and data-based, and try to think about the future. What do data and evidence tell us about the questions for planning? If climate models are as good as they have ever been, why is climate understanding and consensus so low? And what can all of us do to better communicate, as Mike says, the good, the bad, and the ugly about science? What has the World Bank learned about what types of questions need to be asked as part of development finance decision-making? What does it mean to be financially supportive of climate resilience? In our last panel of the day, we wanted to turn home and look at what's happening both here in Connecticut and in the United States. Connecticut, as you know, is a receiving state for many persons who are affected by Hurricane Maria. And it also will require us to think deeply about issues of internal displacement, even though we tend to think of these things as happening far away. We're going to ask questions about what can law and policy tell us to help prepare systems for the displaced communities, and how can we support cities to ensure that all communities are better prepared. Above all, having spoken on refugees and displaced persons in the past, we do not want to leave you in the depths of despair about the state of the climate or the state of populations. Really, this day is intended to galvanize all of you, to think about how you can be an advocate in your personal communities, academic communities, local communities, to innovate and advocate where you are and to help you and the people you work with to find your own path to climate resilience. Commissioner Klee, I cannot wait to hear what you have to say about state initiatives in the absence of leadership elsewhere. In the afternoon, my very good Canadian colleague is going to be speaking about openings left by the adoption of the Paris Accord Agreement. And of course, many of you are here to see the wonderful Anote Tong, who will encourage you to be bold and brave. So we'll talk more about him in a minute. Dane, I know you wanted to ask some more questions.
Yeah, well, thank you. And actually, maybe just try to frame the things that we'll be talking about on a few other issues that you touched on. Today's conference isn't about climate change per se, but as Maya alluded to, a complex set of issues and problems that are interrelated and to which solutions aren't the purview of any single discipline. Rather, these are issues that require various disciplines and actors involved to work together among states, non-states, regions, peoples, developed and developing countries to break down their silos and work together toward what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change terms the common concern of humanity. We're really talking about the limits of adaptation here today. And climate-induced migration and displacement is difficult to define. It's usually never the proximate or sole cause for migration. It's difficult to assess, and it's even more difficult still to proactively prevent and address it before it happens, rather than through piecemeal reactive actions post some natural disaster. One issue is that it seems we may not have had the same epistemological basis for assessing this problem, but now it's clear that we are approaching a common set of facts to understand these challenges. And the latest IPCC report that Maya talked represents really the best scientific knowledge we've ever had. And yet, in spite of that, we still can't agree.
We have this debate all the time.
Yes, exactly. And so what we also know is that climate change increases the intensity of so-called sudden onset events, hurricanes, fires, and floods, and slow onset events such as droughts, glacial retreat, desertification, and sea level rise. And in the case of both types of climate events, any of them can exacerbate already existing socio-political conflict potentials and lead to a tipping point whereby people become displaced or choose to migrate as a last resort or plan migration as a choice of adaptation. Another problem is that climate change makes it harder for those who are already displaced to return to their homes, especially where their capacity to adapt is low or the limits to adaptation have been reached. And at a prelude event to this one that Maya discussed earlier, held in Asheville this year, we heard a story from a UN High Commissioner for Refugees representative about a Somali farmer who said, "Drought made the conflict worse. Some raiders came and took away the little food we had raised on our farm. Now we're in a very hard time. The people at home face conflict and famine. They're starving. Even if we could go back, we would only have dry land and death to greet us." And such stories are becoming all too common and increasingly so. Luckily, in the international climate process, we're seeing convergence around increasing adaptive capacity in the most vulnerable countries. We have a huge chasm between the adaptive capacity of wealthy Western countries and the most vulnerable countries. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest questions that the international climate community is going to have to tackle and face. Inability to adapt can often be a function of bad planning and policy incoherence or a lack of governance structures. For example, providing for food and water security, creating resilient infrastructure. And the presence of relief for migrants determines how quickly they can return. And policymakers in developed countries with high adaptive capacities should really be on notice about the need to scale up the quality of a migrant's ability to contribute economically and participate in a new society. They should provide legal protections and remedies, provide aid and assistance to increase this adaptive capacity in these most vulnerable countries wherever possible. Luckily, interdisciplinary work is well underway in a number of international organizations, fora, and NGOs to consider and address these problems. Some of these are the Task Force on Displacement under the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage and the Paris Agreement process, something we'll hear a little bit about later perhaps. Negotiation of a global compact on migration, the International Organization for Migration, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, etc. All of these are working on this problem of the large and growing chasm between high adaptive capacity and the lack of it. And indeed, this issue really is the common concern of humanity, where every field of human knowledge is being called to arms to address it, and that's what we're hopefully here to talk about today.
Yes, and that's also why I had you introduce yourselves. And so we've actually alluded twice now to Ayman Turkawi sitting in the front there, who will be speaking about the Paris Accord. And I've also asked him to provide also a non-North American perspective on the Paris Accord and the ambitions within. All right, so one housekeeping matter. In order to facilitate the questions with President Tong, we're going to take them in a basket that they're up there. Please write them down, and we will put them up there and try to get them to us by about 10:30. And beyond that, welcome and thank you. I'd like to turn the mic over to Melissa Goodell, who has been an incredible supporter of this project. She is the Associate Director of the Yale Office of Sustainability, and like us, truly appreciates the goal of transformative change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I will just speak very, very briefly. I'm not on the program. I am here as a support person for this team because this is an extraordinary event here at Yale. I'm going to sidetrack for just one moment to tell you a little history lesson. 10 years ago, in 2008, Yale hosted the Conference of Governors on Climate Change. At the time, the occasion was that it was the 100th anniversary of the Conference of Governors, which had originally started with Theodore Roosevelt and a guy named Gifford Pinchot, who started the National Forest Service, but also the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So we felt that we had an imperative to do this, and it would be a really good idea to invite all 50 governors to come to Yale, which was definitely life-changing for those of us who organized it. And the outcome was phenomenal because at the time, this is going to sound very familiar, we were really seriously lacking in federal leadership on climate action. And the governors got together and wrote a declaration to the federal government saying, please, whatever you do, don't supersede what we are doing. We are in a position to be proactive. And it was fairly effective, actually. Bush just sort of looked the other way and let the states keep going. They didn't overrule things like emission standards for cars, et cetera, and it was really quite effective. At the time, Rob Klee was just fresh out of getting 3 degrees here at Yale University. He has a master's degree from FES, a JD from the law school, and a PhD from FES. And he decided to give us a break for a little bit, but then came back to Connecticut and joined our team, our community, I should say, not our team. And he has been a remarkable force for innovation and proaction in the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. With his vision and guidance, Connecticut was one of the first states to step up and say, we are still in. We have a GHG reduction commitment in the state of Connecticut of 80% by 2050. I always flip those. And we were one of the first to do that. We have been extremely progressive on climate change. And when I speak to colleagues abroad, because of Rob and his team and the tremendous work that they've done, I'm able to hold my head up and say, yes, I know. What's happening in Washington, D.C. is a little bit weird and criminal. However, what we're doing here in Connecticut is really going to make a difference. And so I ask you to join me in welcoming Commissioner Klee.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for that introduction and history lesson. Always appreciate coming back to a place where I've spent a lot of time here at Yale. And are you recruiting me to be back on your team? I don't know. It's a nice team here. And really, thank you all for being here, and Maya for inviting me and for assembling this real amazing assembly of diverse people and backgrounds and experiences, which is the climate change challenge in a nutshell, that you need all of those folks working together across so many disciplines and have that be part of so many conversations where it may not be happening enough today. And that's what you're going to talk about over the next 2 days, and particularly focus on climate change and climate refugees. And this is obviously a global phenomena, and that's going to be a lot of your next 2 days, but it has already had local impacts here in Connecticut and across the United States. From Katrina to Maria to Florence, Michael, the list of names is getting way too long. Climate change is causing disruption and migration within the U.S. and its territories. And the most vulnerable among us here in the United States are environmental justice communities, our persons of color, the poor, the young, the old. They're all the most likely to live in flood-prone areas, the most likely to be in those places where sea level rise is going to be impacting them. They're the most vulnerable to heat waves and droughts and those other things that do actually happen, even here in Connecticut. They're most likely to be forced out of their homes by floodwaters. For example, Tropical Storm Irene. Now, there's a blast from the past, 2011, which seems literally a lifetime ago. Our substation, a critical substation in Bridgeport, Connecticut, just 20 minutes down the road. That is, as many of you here in Connecticut know, that is one of our low to moderate income distressed communities here in Connecticut. A substation there serving those 100,000 people in Bridgeport came within inches of being flooded and being out of power for over 2 months. So that is the edge on which we live here, even in Connecticut, in terms of resiliency and climate change that would have dramatic effects in our communities, in our cities here in Connecticut. We're also on the receiving end of climate refugees here in Connecticut, particularly from Puerto Rico and post-Maria. And I was just talking with local legislators from Waterbury yesterday, and it is having a material effect on their communities. It is changing the nature of who is where in their communities, and that is a direct effect of climate refugees happening here in Connecticut. So you're going to explore those issues in depth from local perspectives, global perspectives for the next 2 days, and this is an important conversation, more so now than ever, because there are some at the highest levels of our federal government who are rejecting the science of climate change. They're ignoring the impacts that they're seeing right before their eyes. I want to rest assured that here in Connecticut, we do not ignore this. We listen to scientists. I am a scientist. That is, I'm actually the first scientist to lead our agency. It's something I get a lot of street cred for, particularly my geology background, which folks in my agency are really proud of. We listen to our scientists and not coal lobbyists. I know that seems surprising, but that's what we do here in Connecticut. And we understand the science, and it does guide our actions. I'm not going to spend my next sort of 10 minutes bashing the Trump administration. I do that plenty of other times in other places. That's actually what my Twitter feed is for. You can go follow me at Commissioner Rob. I think that is the main purpose of Twitter, is to have those, it's hard to call those conversations. But in the absence of federal leadership, and with the dire predictions of this very week coming from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's incumbent on local and state governments, particularly here in the United States, to fill the gap we're seeing at the federal level. My goal here is to stay positive, well, mostly positive, and focus on what is working at the local level and regional level. I'm going to do my best to ignore, at least for a morning, what's happening in Washington. It's good to do that on occasion and sort of disconnect from what's going on down there. And you have come to a state, for those who are not from Connecticut, that is setting an example that other states are following and addressing the most pressing problem, environment, energy problem of our time. So over the last 8 years, and Melissa alluded to this, we've been actually putting things into action. We've deployed hundreds of megawatts of clean energy here in Connecticut. We've created innovative financing programs, the first in the nation, Connecticut Green Bank, to deploy renewables and efficiency at scale here in Connecticut. And we've seen investment of over $1 billion in our clean energy economy right here in Connecticut. And that's tens of thousands of clean energy jobs here in Connecticut at a time when we've been challenged in terms of job growth. This past legislative session had 2 transformative pieces of legislation that will actually set us up well for the next decade here in Connecticut on our ability to address climate change and have a clean energy future. And I want to note that here in Connecticut, those were passed with overwhelming bipartisan majorities, literally 34-2, because we count those sort of votes, 34-2 in our Senate and 120 to or 130 to 10 in our General Assembly. That's very different here in Connecticut than what you see in Washington, because progress on climate, the environment, and clean energy is not a partisan issue in Connecticut. And that's actually very refreshing, and why I like working in a place like Connecticut instead of down in Washington. So for those who are interested, this gets technical. Public Act 18-82, we set an interim target to reduce our economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions 45% by 2030. That was recommended by our Governor's Council on Climate Change. We basically looked where we are now, and then, Melissa, we looked at that 80% by 2050 goal. You draw a straight line. Some may argue it should have been more curved and whatnot, but we at least drew a straight line, and where we have to go by 2030 is 45% economy-wide reductions, which, by the way, means you have to electrify everything and clean your grid to a substantially clean level by 2030. This complements our existing on-the-books 80% by 2050 target. Now, we can debate about whether that's enough, particularly because of the IPCC report. That was based on the 2-degree warming scenario and not 1.5 degrees. But we have to have, yes, ambitious, significant action on the books. It's a target. It is not a goal, actually, in Connecticut statutes, to get us on track to where we have to be by 2030 to make sure we are achieving our 2050 goals. That's 12 years. That's where our focus is now for the next decade, is achieving that economy-wide greenhouse gas goal. We also, in that same bill, required all future state projects that are located in our coastal zone to take into account that we are facing up to 20 inches or 50 centimeters of sea level rise on our coast by 2050. 20 or 50 by 2050. We should let that sink in a moment, but if we are putting state or federal money into infrastructure, which the state does, and our infrastructure lasts a long time, it now needs to add 2 feet of freeboard above existing flood elevations to account for what we know is already baked into the system in terms of sea level rise. And that is a significant amount of change in a very short amount of time. And unfortunately, the Northeast happens to be one of those places around the globe where we will experience more sea level rise than most other places around the globe. And on the break, there are some fun sort of geoscience and the Gulf Stream currents of why that's the case. We also passed Public Act 18-50 that's increasing our renewable portfolio standard to 40% Class 1 renewables, so wind and solar, by 2030, which when you combine that with the nuclear power and large-scale hydropower means we're going to have a 65 to 75% clean grid by 2030. And that's essential to have the clean grid when you're electrifying transportation and you're building heating to make sure that those electrons are as clean as possible when they're powering our cars and homes. We also continued our efforts to deploy rooftop solar and solar on our businesses, and we created a statewide shared clean energy program targeting, in particular, low and moderate income customers to make sure that they're part of this clean energy revolution as well. Last month in San Francisco at the Global Climate Action Summit, we joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Our last coal-fired power plant in Connecticut will stop running by 2021. We also committed to phase out super pollutant HFCs and refrigeration. On transportation, for those of you who are here in Connecticut, we actually built 2 mass transit systems in the last 8 years, a dedicated busway that has seen ridership they weren't anticipating until 2030 already today, and a New Haven, Hartford, Springfield rail line. Again, for someone who's grown up and lived in Connecticut, these are transformative transportation choices, which means that you don't have to have a car if you want to go to work or to school. And that is good for us here in Connecticut from a emission standpoint, from a local emission standpoint, but is also good for the planet. If you need to own a car, we are the first state in the nation to be range confident. We have enough public vehicle charging stations spread around we're not a very large state, but they're spread strategically that you can go anywhere you're no more than 20 minutes from a charging station. And we have our very successful rebate program, the CHEAPER program, which stands for Connecticut Hydrogen Electric Automobile Purchase Rebate Program, but we like cheaper, which is an on-the-hood rebate when you buy that electric vehicle. And we've sold over 3,000. Last month, we sold 230. We're seeing now, particularly with the Tesla Model 3s, the exponential growth in electric vehicle sales. So I've just covered a few of the policy implementation and innovations that are happening in Connecticut. I know my time is limited here, but I want to be recognize for a moment, for those of you who are not from Connecticut, we're not a very large state. We often we're the third smallest in the country. Some of you may be from cities or counties that are larger than Connecticut. But we punch above our weight class, and we do that often with partnerships. And we partner with states throughout this region. One example of that is our regional greenhouse gas initiative. Connecticut is part of the founding member, it is the first cap-and-trade system, market-based mechanism that put a price on carbon from the electric sector, where we saw 50% reductions in emissions, while our per capita GDP grew faster than the national average. So it breaks that myth that that you're going to do this, you're going to crash the economy. No, our economies grew faster than the nation. That cap-and-trade system allowed our 8 states, to invest over $2 billion in clean energy and efficiency here in Connecticut and throughout the Northeast and into the Mid-Atlantic. And now New Jersey and Virginia are looking to be a part of that as well. And the other collaboration worth mentioning, and Melissa mentioned it, we're still in the U.S. Climate Alliance. When Trump announced his decision to withdraw from Paris, it was not a surprise. It was still disappointing. But 17 states with Democratic and Republican governors stepped in and stepped up and said, we're actually going to follow the scientists and commit our communities, our states, to the planet that we're still in. And that 17-state alliance represents $9 trillion in economic activity. It's the third largest country in the world. So this is not an incident. Now, California and New York help. Connecticut is not all of that. We're actually a very small slice of that. But it is what is hopefully part of, should hopefully inspire, it inspires us to move forward. California is that tip of the spear that we're all trying to keep up with, although we occasionally do some things that I think force them to go a little deeper in their emissions and their commitments. When I want to stay positive and hopeful, I often turn to President Obama. I'm having trouble finding Trump quotes that I could weave into my speeches, so I have to go back to Obama. And in his farewell address, and this one is particularly relevant to this conference, when he was talking to the nation as a whole, he said, without bolder action, our children won't have time to debate the existence of climate change. They'll be busy dealing with its effects. The environmental disasters, economic disruptions, and waves of climate refugees seeking sanctuary. Now, we can and should argue about the best approach to the problem, but to simply deny the problem not only betrays future generations, it betrays the essential spirit of innovation and practical problem solving that guided our founders. I do know that quote was from 2016. It's a little out of date because it's not our kids that are dealing with the disasters, the economic disruption, and the climate refugees. It's us, and it's now. But putting that aside, the main message is of innovation, problem solving, and that's the core of, frankly, what America does best, or at least used to do best. And state and local and regional governments have long been and will continue to be those innovators in the policy space. We don't have to look so far back in history I'll quote another president because I'm in the sort of mode this morning. President Kennedy, who was announcing that we should go to the moon in his famous speech at Rice University, said, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. So those are the types of things I think we need at this moment, that type of galvanizing spirit, that singular mission, the moonshot, that one thing is to get to net zero carbon, to get our planet in a place where we are able to save it, to galvanize the political will, the technical understanding, the innovation to make that possible, make that happen. It's going to be hard. There will be setbacks. These are not easy things, but it is the only thing we can do for the sake of future generations. So I hope part of this conference gets you excited and energized about those things that you can do in each of your spheres of influence to make that possible. And I hope that you look to the political will of not the federal government at this moment in time, but look at Connecticut and California and New York and Massachusetts and Maryland and Washington State, Oregon, Jersey, Vermont. Those are the places to look for the innovation, the examples of folks who are doing everything that they can at this moment in time in particular. And that, to me, is encouraging, and it is essential. And that sort of commitment to real action, which we have here in Connecticut and those other states, I believe is contagious. So thank you so much for having me this morning. Sure. I'm happy to take questions if there's quick ones. Just.
45% by 2030 sounds great. And so can you imagine 100% net zero by 2050? So that's what the IPCC essentially is all predicated on. Those scenarios.
It is possible. Our scenarios have been based on our 80% by 2050 goal. We would have to be a little more ambitious, particularly in that 2030 to 2050 time frame. And what is always fascinating about these, the sort of projections we did, we went through a modeling exercise. It always looks at what you have now and your ability to scale up all the things that you have in your current portfolio. And it is doable with electrification of vehicles. Now, that would be, by 2030, hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles on the road when we now have 5,000. So tremendous increases there. And by 2050, you're only selling zero-emission, particularly light-duty vehicles. The heavy duties get a little more complicated. You need to find some other solutions there. Electrification of homes. You need to turn about, we're modeling about 11,000 or so homes per year transition from, in Connecticut's oil or natural gas, to air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps. That's level of turnover of the thing in your basement, which most people don't want to think about most of the time, is not nearly as sexy as a Tesla, which I think more people will be more likely to buy electric vehicles because they are, frankly, the best and coolest and most fun things out there. Your furnace is never that. That's one where we're concerned about. Now, in the near term, you can, if you have those big three wedges, vehicles, home heating and cooling, or business home heating and cooling, and your grid, if you're falling on one, you can press the accelerator on another and make up for it in the near term. By 2050, they all have to be basically zero carbon. They all have to do that. And frankly, the IPCC report and others recognize that there will also be a need to probably pull out of the atmosphere to do things in the either through afforestation, reforestation, draw more carbon out of the atmosphere, because many of those curves get above and beyond where we should be and require that pulling back to actually achieve a sustainable level. Whether those hit tipping points and other things, there's a lot of risk involved in, we'll just go over the line for a while and we'll figure out a way to bring it back under the line is another question. In Connecticut, though, and we often, some folks say, well, why did you care? In Connecticut, you're the slice of a slice of a slice. But what we're mostly focused on is the innovations in the policy space that could be translatable and transferable. And we're going to keep doing that because you get things like our regional greenhouse gas initiative, 50% reductions from the power sector in a matter of 10 years. So that type of, it is possible to do. And it's those types of examples, particularly in the near term. And I'm trying to focus mostly on the next 12 years because those are critical. If we can't do that, we definitely are screwed for 2050. And that's the technical term, screwed. I'm a commissioner who's allowed to say those sorts of things. One more.
Let's take one more question.
Right there.
Are there any local or regional science needs that you've identified that might be helpful in policy making?
So the question is, are local regional science needs? One of the things that we've done is partner with UConn, our state university, on that understanding of our localized sea level rise risk. So that's been an area which we're going to keep updating year over year, but that's been an area where we've really taken the science and said, in statute, do whatever the scientists tell you, plan for whatever the scientists tell you about sea level rise in Connecticut. I'm sure there are probably other good examples of that type of thing. And we are actually a state where you can pass that into law, which is amazing to think of, that in state law, it literally references the scientists who will come up with that number that you have to plan to and then build your buildings to and incorporate that level of sea level rise. If you have ideas, come see me afterwards of places that we can bring that best science to our local policy.
And I will wrap it up there, but hopefully we'll have time for a very short break before our keynote. We have a panel that I'd very much like to get to now. So, Commissioner, thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks for having me.